before we dig too far into this, let's do a recap about last week a little bit, because of course, just as we were getting started, we were going to have a talk about like all these church terms. What is a dean? What is a provost? What is a rector? Are they the same thing? What is a canon vicar? What is a canon? What is a priest or a minister or a pastor? We use all these words. What do they mean? Are they different? Are they just synonyms? And I got whisked away right as we were getting started. And of course, our new dean, Lisa, came in and was ready to have a conversation about what a dean versus a provost is. So I hope it was a good conversation.
It was amazing.
That's great. Okay. Enlightening. Good. So it was a serendipitous moment. I got whisked away.
It was very.
Okay. Excellent. Did that lead to any questions you had now, or do we? I can move right along onto the next thing, but
it was more dean versus provost, and Lisa's personal story, which was absolutely fabulous.
Okay.
And we all enjoyed, but we didn't get into the details of rector and vicar.
But it was very much so. It was very much a
things.
dean versus provost, and her journey for how she came
And
brought in here for
very
an associate to being a sub dean to being a provost to being a dean.
Yeah, the
Okay.
right reverend, exactly.
I mean, it's like, one, you're more subject to the local church and the vestry. The other one, you're maybe more, there's more bigger powers under the umbrella of the bishop, under the diocese. It's kind of a bigger umbrella.
Okay.
So I think we got kind of.
And vicar's kind of a new name here.
Yes. Okay. Yes, it is. And there's at least some story to that. And part of it was because at the time I couldn't be. Hi. You're welcome to join us if you'd like. Of course. So when the shift was happening and Dominic moved away to go be the dean in York Minster, and Lisa went from being the dean to the new dean essentially, but we were calling her provost. And I was stepping in and really couldn't be the sub-dean because you can't have a sub-dean if you don't have a dean. That doesn't make any sense. And we're not going to call me a sub-provost because that's not a thing. We're done making up new terms.
So when you were hired to be a sub-dean?
Essentially, when I was brought in was the sort of game of musical chairs of
right.
Lisa was becoming the new Dominic, I was becoming the new Lisa, everybody move over a chair.
Yeah.
But the question was what to call me.
Okay.
And so we couldn't go with sub-dean, we couldn't go with assistant dean. So we went with Canon for pastoral care and outreach, which at the time was more my portfolio, was specifically pastoral care and outreach. But then as I took on the more of the responsibilities for formation and children's ministries and youth ministry and other areas, it just became a misleading title. It was confusing to people. And so Lisa and I were thinking through what to call me. And we borrowed from a Church of England term, and we borrowed from what a couple of other cathedrals around have done. St. John the Divine in New York, Christ Church Cathedral in Indianapolis, Christ Church Cathedral in Houston, all have a canon vicar. And the canon vicar role is very much the person whose job it is to take the strategic vision of the dean and to operationalize it for the programs of the church. To take this vision that Lisa is casting and to say, now to get into the programs of the church as a parish and operationalize those. The canon vicar's role is usually to maintain and manage the parish life of the cathedral, because we're a cathedral, but we're also a parish. And so while Lisa's very much over maintaining the cathedral life of the community, my focus is very much on the inner parish life of the community. That makes sense.
Yeah, that seems like an awfully lofty job. I'm just going to say, for the parish life of a cathedral is much larger than a parish life of a small church.
Fair enough. I mean,
I admire it.
Yeah,
That's what
no,
I'm saying. I mean, I like. Yeah, you're saying it's overseeing the parish.
Yeah.
We are also a parish, but we're a parish of a cathedral.
well, that's true. That's
Which
true.
makes us,
With its own nuances and
a little
everything.
bigger.
That's at least part of why I will say that's at least part of why when Dominic and Lisa were looking for somebody, they made sure they brought in somebody who already had experience as a rector of a church,
Right.
running a parish already, rather than say bringing in a new curate right out of seminary who never had that experience. So, and so yes, I would say that makes sense because they brought in somebody who had experience with with leading a parish to come in and be over that parish life.
I think the biggest challenge, and I think it's all because you have a lot of talent, but a lot of times you have a cathedral, you have a lot of people working, and sometimes parishes you don't. And here we have a cathedral, but how many people do we have working? We have very few bodies.
That's what I
so
mean.
again,
That's a
to be
lot. That's
short
a
talent
lot.
get all the talent you have to offer to fill all these positions. I mean, that's just,
Yeah.
you're so fortunate that you came to us. I mean, that's
Well, I feel mutually fortunate. Yes, thank you. I feel mutually fortunate. It's funny though that then Lisa and I were having this conversation about what to call me because we can't call me a sub-dean because there's no dean. So we said, Lisa and I were sitting in her office one day and she said, let's borrow from this Church of England title, we'll call you Canon Vicar, because that's kind of that role. And then right at that time, the cathedral chapter and the bishop had said, we're going to make you dean. So I could have been the sub-dean after all, right? We were making all these titles up for nothing because I could have just done that. But that's all right because the decision had already been made
I
at
like the
that
name
point.
Canon Vicar.
It is, but it takes a fair amount of explaining to help people understand like what that job
Sub-dean
is.
is more clear.
Vicar, so vicar comes. Well, so vicar comes from it's the same root word where we get vicarious.
Right.
Vicar. Essentially the vicar. So the vicar of a church is the person who operates running the parish community in the absence of the bishop or the dean. So think about like the country vicar in England when you think of like the country vicar on the BBC shows is the person who's running the life of the community when the bishop is not there, which is most of the time because the bishop is around doing lots of other things. So the bishop has lots of vicars who are vicariously doing the work of the bishop when they're not around. And in that way, you can think of this as vicariously doing the work of the dean and the bishop when they're not around, like today. So vicarious. That's another way of thinking about it.
Are you the only vicar in the diocese?
That's a good question. Probably not the only. So the other title for vicar that gets used is if a church community is not a self-sustaining church that is and that it's assisted by, it's called a mission, and it's sustained by the diocese who helps fund and pay for a clergy person to be there while the mission grows into being a full parish. And at a parish, it means it's self-sustaining and it can cover its own operating budget and the cost of its own clergy. So typically the person who's the head of a mission that's not quite self-sustaining yet is the vicar, because they're vicariously running the church instead of for the bishop on the bishop's behalf. Once a church gets long enough that it can sustain itself, it becomes a parish, and we actually have to vote for that. If you remember in the Constitution and Canons, we were talking about how the community gets to vote to make a new parish. They would take a church that's in mission status and say, you've now passed all of the requirements, you are a self-sustaining church, you can provide your own clergy person, you no longer need the diocese to be running administration for you, you are now a parish, and the head clergy person of that would go from being a vicar to a rector, and then of course if it's a cathedral, we call that person a dean. And this, Lisa told you all this part already, right? So in the case of a cathedral, it's a little bit different because it's the cathedral of the diocese as well. So the rector there is called the dean and has special appointments by the bishop because it's the cathedral for the whole diocese. So the bishop is more involved in the process. So there may be other head clergy people who are heads of congregations in the Diocese of Chicago that are not parishes, they're missions. And the clergy person for that would be a vicar, not a rector.
Is St. Martin's a mission or a parish?
It's funny. So I think technically it's funny. I think technically it's a mission, and technically Christopher Griffin is the vicar of St. Martin's. They don't have a vestry. They have a bishop's committee, which does the work of the vestry, but it's appointed by the bishop. I think that's technically true, but we just call Chris the rector of St. Martin's, and we call their bishop's committee a vestry. We're just being less technically accurate about it. But I think that's actually the case. So, yeah.
The title canon, how do you become a canon? And I mean, why are you a canon? Lay people can become canons too, correct?
That's true. So a canon's so a canon is specifically somebody who has been appointed and approved by the bishop to do work of the cathedral or the diocese. And so that means, in my case, Bishop Chilton, when I'll remember Chilton Knudsen, when Chilton was here, Bishop Chilton appointed me to serve in the cathedral as a cathedral clergy person. So that's why I'm a canon of the cathedral. Members of her staff that serve the diocese. There's the canon to the ordinary. The canon, that's just a fancy word meaning the canon to the bishop. The ordinary is the bishop. And it's essentially the chief of staff for the bishop's office. There's frequently a canon for transition ministries who's over all of the new incoming clergy and all the outgoing clergy and settling new leaders in parishes and helping people through seminary to be ordained. There's a lot of transitions. So typically, a lot of dioceses have a canon for transitions. Try to think of other canons we have here. And then there are lay canons. Yeah, there were lay canons who are, so we have a canon for communications. Crystal Plumbers is a canon for communications and marketing and digital management and all of that. She's not an ordained priest, but she works on behalf of the bishop for the management of the diocese.
So do you lose the title? I mean, if you become a rector of the
Yeah,
church,
so if I take another job somewhere else, yes, I would not be a canon. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's specifically while on the bishop's behalf, I'm serving here at the cathedral specifically.
How about priest in charge?
Priest in charge, yes. So that is a relatively new term that has been coming up a lot more in the church. And I think Micah Jackson might have even mentioned that when he was here giving his talk. So priest in charge is essentially a parish or a vestry that has selected a priest to come and do all of the work that a rector does in terms of the management of the staff and leading the worship life and the liturgy of the community, but has not been given tenured status as a rector.
Like Jim Stein, perhaps?
So like Jim,
We
yeah.
came
Yeah.
here for a brief time.
So yeah, Jim was not, the intention was not to make Jim the new dean, right? He was here just temporarily. There's a lot of churches that are, because of the nature of the Constitution and canons, when somebody is made a rector, and this is important for our Episcopal polity here, when somebody is made a rector, they can't just be fired if you don't like them. And so it's not like, say, Baptist church or Presbyterian church where the lay committee can get together and say, we don't like you anymore, we're going to have a vote of no confidence and fire you. When a church in the Episcopal church selects a rector, that person is in a permanent position until they either die, retire due to mandatory retirement age, are removed for some sort of misconduct, but they can't just quit and they can't be fired. This is an important distinction because the rector of the church doesn't work for the congregation. The rector of the church, remember, is actually working for the bishop. Does that make sense? Kind of? Okay. So when somebody is made a rector, you can't just decide, oh, we've changed our mind, we don't like you after all, we're just going to get rid of you. Making Lisa the dean, for what you all will now, you're stuck with her. Now that you've made her the dean, she can't be made undeaned by vote of the vestry. Like the vestry can't change their minds and undean her. So when she was the provost, she was on a contract.
Right.
And when that contract was up, in theory. So that's kind of the priest in charge number. It's we've brought in a priest, we're going to give you all the responsibilities, but if we decide we don't like the job you're doing, we could just let you go because we didn't make you a rector. And so more and more churches are doing this thing these days where they will bring in somebody and make them a priest in charge first, have them be priest in charge for a couple of years, and then make the decision, will we have you stay on as our rector, or is this not a good fit and we'll part ways? Because once we make you rector, we're stuck. You can't quit and you can't be fired. Yeah.
So, when Dominic was searched for and found and made dean, was that the bishop's staff that made that search, or was that the vestry, the chapter of the cathedral that made that search?
Yeah, no, good
Yes.
question. A good question. So, in a normal parish setting, the vestry would form a search committee to search for a new clergy person. Would usually pick a person and vote to hire. We're going to hire Marcy is going to be our new rector. We're going to hire Marcy. Usually it has to go to the bishop's office for the bishop to say, yes, I approve, or no, I don't approve. But it's largely left up to the parish to do their search and their interviews and their process to select a person. The bishop would really only say no if there was some reason why the bishop knows something that the vestry doesn't know. Yeah, well, it would be like if the bishop calls up seriously, if the bishop calls up the bishop from what other diocese Marcy's coming from and saying, no, Marcy, don't hire Marcy. Don't hire her. Sorry, this took a turn when I used you as an example. And so if there was some reason why it would not be good to do, the bishop might veto it, right? But largely lets the parish decide. In the case of the cathedral, because it's the cathedral of the whole Diocese of Chicago, the bishop is much more involved in the process of finding and approving a person. Jeff Lee, for what it's worth, Jeff Lee was very involved in the process of bringing Dominic Barrington here to Chicago, met with him, interviewed him, was very involved in the process to bring Dominic here. And Paula Clark as well has been very involved in the process of taking Lisa and making her the dean of the cathedral. So it's more of the bishop and the cathedral chapter are very involved for the dean. Yeah.
So can't quit, can't be fired.
Right.
Dominic was dean
Yes.
and then left.
So he took another job. Well, the Queen called him to come and be the Dean of York Minster. He technically had to get the permission of the bishop to leave his position here to go there. Now the bishop's not going to say no, partly because you can imagine the situation that would happen if you took a person who said, I've been called to be the Dean of York Minster, and the bishop says, no, I'm going to make you stay here. That's not going to be good for anybody. You won't be happy here, we won't be happy with the situation. So there's really very little reason why a bishop would ever step in and say, no, I refuse to let you take this other job. But technically, the rector of a church though can't just quit. They need the permission of the bishop to leave their position, and can't be fired by the vestry because, again, the vestry, the rector doesn't work for the vestry. Now the vestry can go to the bishop. There is a process for the vestry to go to the bishop and say, we're having a problem here. We really don't like this person. It's not a good fit. It's bad for us. We need you to help us with this. And at the end of sort of a process of exploration, the bishop and the clergy person and the vestry could decide, you know what, this isn't a good fit. We really should separate this relationship. But it's not a straight out, we don't like you, we vote to fire you. There's a whole process that gets involved.
I was going to say about priest in charge, isn't it also partially popular now because it's a cost-saving way to avoid it?
I mean, there is something to be said for we can pay a priest in charge less than we can pay a rector. There's that. And because we are a church that more and more don't have the opportunity to take a priest right out of seminary and put them in a curacy. To be a curate, that's another term. A curate is usually a new priest that's right from seminary and is put in a parish setting where it's like a mentorship. And there's an experienced priest there who's helping mentor this new clergy person in the ways of being a parish pastor. And those used to be really common in the church, but because the church has essentially less money and fewer people than we used to have, and we have a lot of parishes that because of the baby boom, we planted a lot of churches during the baby boom that now we're sort of retracting back, and now it's the same thing that happened with all the elementary schools, right? When you see empty elementary schools, it's because of the baby boom, we made a ton of schools because there were so many kids, and then the next generation there weren't as many kids and we have all these empty schools. And then you notice through the pipeline, then we had a lot of empty high schools because we built so much up during the baby boom for all these kids, and then we didn't have as many. You're seeing the same thing happen in the parishes where we did a lot of plants out in the suburbs and out far out from Chicago because of the baby boom. We had so many people. Now we're kind of retracting back to where we were pre-baby boom. What that's meant is a lot of those curacies have gone away, and you're seeing more and more clergy people that have to go right from seminary right into being the head of a church somewhere. What we used to do is take people right out of seminary and say, boom, now you're a rector in a church. You've never been doing this before. You're inexperienced about this community. You don't know the community that well yet, other than probably a couple hour-long interviews. And now you are indelibly linked to one another and can't be extracted through being fired or quitting. You are now fused in this relationship. I hope you can see why that could be problematic. Because it may be you're there for 6 months and you realize, oh, this wasn't a good fit. But now we're stuck because there's no way to get out of it because of the canons and constitution of our church. So as a result, that's why I think part of what you're starting to see more and more is churches saying, we'll make someone a priest in charge, we'll get to know them some, so that we're not stuck. And it's just, if we get 6 months or a year in and we say, no harm, no foul, we're not the fit we thought we would be, now we can simply separate without having this whole canonical process that gets the bishop involved in everything. So that's part of why you see more and more of the priest in charge as well.
So some positions you can apply for the permanent job, some you cannot. So the priest in charge, then after he's put in his 6 months of time, then apply for the permanent open position of, or sometimes when you're in a certain parish or you're serving a certain area, you can apply for the opening job at that place.
Right, yes. So Lisa, using Lisa as an example, you could imagine the provost and dean thing, just imagine it with the titles of priest in charge and rector instead. Mostly like that. When the vestry decided to make Lisa the provost, it was specifically put into that contract, and she will be eligible for consideration to stay on as dean. And it was important we put that in the contract because sometimes in that contract it is we're bringing you in for 3 years, you're temporary, you won't be in consideration for the permanent person that we hire. And so for us, it was always in our consideration, when Lisa was made provost, it was always in our consideration that she might then stay on as dean. And so it was in the contract right from the very beginning. It depends on how the agreement is made. Most of the time, if you're looking at it from the perspective of, we think you're the right person, we think this is a really good fit, we're going to bring you on as the priest in charge, and it's almost kind of a probationary, let's get to know each other and find out if we're as good of a fit as we think we are, and then we'll make you rector. That's becoming more and more common, so the person would be able to stay on. Jim Steen, for example, is a different case. So Jim Steen would be an example of somebody who he was brought on to be the priest in charge here, but it was never the intention for him to stay on as the dean. It was always to be a temporary thing while we figured out who we wanted to bring on as dean. Does that make sense? Oh, so many hands.
Another question about priest in charge. Is it a way of subverting going to a search committee where you ask the bishop to send you someone?
Yes, you bring up a useful question. So, this is actually what I wanted to talk about today. Actually, this is in the agenda for today. I'm not gonna dig into the canons and find the small text on this. Actually, just to say, in our Constitution, and I don't know why it just died. It's just off. In our Constitution and canons, there's lots and lots of rules about what a rector has the authority to do. And it specifically says in our Constitution, a rector has tenure. A rector can't be fired. A rector can't quit. A rector has to meet these specific needs. A rector has to make sure the annual report is submitted every year. A rector is responsible for heading the vestry. It's all a rector, a rector, rector. It's the only clergy term that is actually specifically in the canons of the church. You are either, as far as the canons go, you are either a rector or you are not. So all these terms, curate, associate priest, assistant priest, canon vicar, like all of these other terms are basically, you are non-rector clergy. And so you don't have the same sort of status. So Lisa can decide she doesn't like me very much and wants to get rid of me. It doesn't take the same process to get rid of me, right? So I think that's an important distinction, is because when you're hiring somebody or terminating somebody or applying rules to somebody, if you don't hire them as a rector, all these rules don't apply. and you could see a scenario where there are parishes that would say, we don't want to hire a rector, we want to hire a priest in charge, because then we don't have to follow any of these canons. And I think I saw Rachel, and then I'll get to Kim.
Would you explain interim ministry, like St. Paul and the Redeemer down in Hyde Park? They brought on an interim minister for 3 years. But part of that is in that contract is that he may not apply.
May not apply, you said. Yeah, and so that may be the case, that this person is brought in as an interim priest, going to do the priestly functions that we need somebody to do, but is not going to ultimately be our pick for rector. And and there's some clarity about just setting that right at the front. There is some clarity about, there's a peace of mind that can kind of come from knowing this person is going to be here for 3 years, they're going to help us through this search process, they're not going to be picked, or they are going to be picked, but there's no sort of gray area of are they and aren't they. I've always kind of imagined, I've never done an interim position myself, but I've always kind of imagined there's a certain freedom in knowing that you've been brought on, you'll be here for 3 years, and you're not going to be vying with others for contention over whether or not you'll be the priest. You know what your term is, and you can just focus on that. So yeah, at SPR, it's one of those things where they want to have a search, but they need a priest to be doing all of the things. Now notice, they're not a rector, and so typically when you have an interim priest that's brought in to serve the community, they're leading worship, they're leading the preaching rota, they're setting all that up, but typically the vestry, that person is not leading the vestry. You have the senior wardens probably leading the vestry meetings. Now there may be some who don't follow that rule, I don't know.
That's not the case.
I was going to say, is that not the case at St. John's? Okay. So, technically, say the interim priest at St. John's, for example, interim rector at St. John's, has not specifically been by canon given the authority to run the vestry meetings. Now the vestry may functionally be saying, you're maybe having to do it anyway.
But isn't there just a practical need for that interim person, whether it's one person for a year, 3 years, whatever, whether it's a different priest every week? you can't decide on who the new rector is overnight.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It's just functionally, that's
Yeah.
why the transition
Yeah.
process has
Yeah.
become one of those, we'll bring in somebody to serve as our priest temporarily while we have a 2-year search, or
Yeah.
sometimes a 3-year search.
Yeah.
Tim, did you still have your comment or question?
Is it, in this technical sense, is a dean a rector?
And so yes, for the purposes of the canons, the dean is the rector of the cathedral. And you will even see in a lot of places, we don't use this term here, but in a lot of places in the cathedrals, they will say dean and rector Lisa Hackney James. So she's technically dean and rector of the cathedral. We just call her the dean though. But she falls under all of the canons here for a rector of a parish.
I was gonna say,
Like,
Grace
but you have something to say.
I was gonna say, going back to the, now leaving the title of dean and vicar, rector, everything like that. What about diocese, cathedral chapter versus vestry? There's a difference too.
Yeah, essentially, so yes. So,
Grace Cathedral doesn't have a vestry. Grace Cathedral in San Francisco has a cathedral chapter.
as a cathedral chapter.
Yeah.
And that's true for us as well. We technically don't have a vestry here. You may hear me say vestry a lot. Right, we call it, colloquially, I may slip into calling it the vestry. It's the vestry of the cathedral is called the cathedral chapter. The big difference between just a vestry of a parish and a cathedral chapter, they have all the same rights and responsibilities, but because it's the cathedral of the whole diocese, it has members on it that are not from St. James. So we have members on the cathedral chapter who are voting here, who are members of other parishes, because it's the cathedral for everybody. But it functions with all the same authority and responsibilities of a vestry. It just has additional members from outside. And so it's called the cathedral chapter. And again, it's like an old, like Church of England term. There was a Church of England term where it used to be, there was a building in the cathedrals that was even usually known as the chapter house, right? And that would be where chapter members would go in, kind of like conclave style, right? The chapter members would go in, and they were all the voting members, and it involved like all of the canons. For example, so if you're made a canon of the cathedral, you were a voting member of the chapter. So you had some clergy who were canons, and some clergy that were not canons. And so one of the differences was the canon clergy would go into the chapter house meeting and could vote over how the church would be run. And so it would involve, in Church of England, it would involve like local dignitaries from town. The mayor may be a member of the chapter and could come in and could vote on the running of the cathedral in the community. Yeah.
Is that the same canon as the non-clergy that we have here, like Robert Black and Stephen Buzard, when they were made canons? Does that mean they're on chapter as voting members by that title, by that role?
Right. So we don't exactly follow it exactly how the Church of England did it. Like, this is where it came from the Church of England. Here we have, I would say, there's a difference between an honorary canon and a residentiary canon. Make it even messier now. So, an honorary canon would be like Henry Leach. You don't remember Henry? When we made him a canon of the cathedral, it was very much an honorific to say you are important to us here. And we've done the same with Robert Black. We've done the same with Stephen Buzard. It's kind of a status thing to say you are essential to the life of the community. We're going to name you a canon of the cathedral, but actually doesn't give them the same like voting rights and privileges as member of the cathedral chapter, and if they quit and leave their jobs, they wouldn't be canons here any longer. That's different than, say, someone like Sandra Castillo. Anyone know Sandra? So Sandra Castillo, who has been made a residentiary canon of the cathedral, or canon of the diocese, sorry. So no matter where Sandra goes or what Sandra does, and she's the leader of our sanctuary task force, sanctuary committee here for the diocese. She will remain a canon because she's been named permanently so by the bishop. This is different than an honorary. It's like making somebody an honorary doctor, right? It's not to be diminishing of it. I don't mean to be diminishing of it. It's a great honor. When you bestow on somebody, it's a great honor to be made an honorary doctor. It's not the same as if you've been conferred that degree of a doctorate, even though we call it the same thing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Where does venerable come in?
Venerable. So we have, this is good because there's a difference between sort of occupation and title and style, and so the style is the method of referring to somebody by their honorific. So if you're referring to a judge and you would say, the Honorable so-and-so, right? That's the style that you refer to them. Your Royal Majesty. Your Royal Majesty. There's the style that you refer to them. And the style changes based on the ordained person's position. The Reverend, which essentially means the revered, right? Like reverend. Don't revere me. But the dean of the cathedral is very reverend. A little more reverend. We will call a bishop the Right Reverend. And the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church is the Most Reverend. And essentially, it's a style. By style, it's the term that means this is how a person is referred to by their honorifics for who they are. That's different than my occupation here, where I am a canon of the cathedral. I'm the Reverend. Even if, let me just say, what's an example?
Would venerable be,
Oh, I'm sorry, the venerable. I'm sorry, and then you asked about venerable. Venerable is usually reserved for, so an archdeacon of the church. So it's not a priest, is ordained a deacon. Mike Choquette here in the Diocese of Chicago is our archdeacon here in Chicago, and his style, the way you refer to him, the style is the Venerable Mike Choquette, archdeacon of, and the archdeacon is specifically the person who is over the care and concerns of all of the deacons of the diocese to make sure that our deacons are well cared for.
But regular deacons aren't venerable?
Right, they're not venerable. They would simply be the reverend, yes. Yeah.
But Canon Williams was actually ordained too. So it just happened.
The venerable.
He was archdeacon.
But he was archdeacon. Right.
Or maybe he was under.
But when he was the archdeacon, he became venerable. Again, like venerate, right? He's venerable.
He was.
You could venerate him.
Is there another way a person can be a canon other than the two you mentioned? I was thinking specifically of Marian Hoover. She was part of the community. She was never ordained. Then she left the community. She moved out of the state, but she was still a canon at St. James.
Right, and we have these honorary canons. It's very much like bestowing an honorary doctorate, the way a college.
Never lose the title.
Yeah, I mean, the honorary, because it's an honorific.
Okay.
I mean, it's like when an educational institute gives somebody an honorary doctorate, we as the cathedral could give someone an honorary canonship, an honorary canonship. And it's an honorific.
This is a lot.
Yes, we have a list of people we have made honorary canons. They don't come to the cathedral chapter and vote on things. It's a nice title to say we are honoring you in this way.
So like Sandra, the residentiary canon you mentioned, she's a canon to the cathedral chapter or to like a
for the diocese. So specifically, the bishop has made her a canon of the diocese for her work for multicultural ministries and the sanctuary task force and everything. So she's not a canon that serves here in the cathedral.
But she's on. That means she's a voting member in certain committees or something like that, or not necessarily, or is not necessarily.
Not really in this case. Yeah. So this is where the Church of England and the United States kind of fall apart in the differences.
So with respect to the cathedral chapter, residentiary canons would just be priests clergy who have voting rights on chapter. Is that?
That's kind of where it comes from. Yeah, that's the root of where it came from.
And that's how it works here with our chapter. Like you as a canon clergy have voting rights, or do all priests generally are just?
The way we're doing it here in this case, we will vote on members of our cathedral chapter and have them be voting members, and I will sit on cathedral chapter. Neither Lisa nor I will vote on chapter things.
I see.
So it's not really like a president of the Senate that gets the tie-breaking vote. If there's a tie, we don't really do it exactly like that.
I see.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, you've mentioned several times that the same people that wrote the U.S. Constitution and founded the country are the people that founded the Episcopal Church. So in the country, in the U.S. Constitution and public life, secular life, they went out of their way to get rid of the titles Lord and Duke and,
right.
the Honorable and everything. Yet the Episcopal Church decided to retain them all.
Retained a
It's
lot
just
of these
kinda
things.
interesting.
Yes. Well, and part of that is we also in the church, we've gone through cycles of being more Protestant and more Catholic.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been times in the life of the Episcopal Church where we did away with a lot of these things. Even here in the Diocese of Chicago, in recent history, when Jeff Lee was here, I'm just making sure that's not the 11 o'clock. So in recent history, in the Diocese of Chicago, we did away with all the canons. There was no canon to the ordinary. We just called them director for administration. And we got rid of the canon for communications and canons for transition ministry. We just called them like transitions officer and director of communications. And we did away with all of those. And we got rid of, as we stopped calling people canons here. That's really something that's only come back now. Bishop Lee is gone, Bishop Paula Clark has come in, and this is more her style, is bringing back a lot of these positions. So she has now named her staff. The director of administration is now back to being called the canon to the ordinary again. So even within our church, those things have there was a time in the life of our church you would not have called somebody Father. You wouldn't have called me Father Balke or Father Stephen. You would have called me Mr. Balke. I would have gone by Mr. And in the life of the Episcopal Church, you called your clergy people Mr., not the Reverend, during sort of like more Protestant swings in the life of the community. But then as we kind of make a more Catholic swing in the life of the community, we go back to calling people Reverend again. So.
Yes.
Where does Brenda fit in all of this?
Yes, so Brenda is our deacon here. All deacons, so this is and I know I need to wrap up in a moment, but all deacons are appointed by the bishop. Deacons serve the bishop, and this goes all the way back to the Acts of the Apostles. This is biblical, right? Unlike priests in charge, rector, vicar, curate, canon, all that, none of that's in the Bible, just to be clear. Those are things we've made, but the role of deacons working for the bishop goes back to Holy Scriptures in the Acts of the Apostles, when the first bishops, the leaders of the early Christian church, who were over feeding and caring for and baptizing the church community, as it got to grow to be too large and the bishops just couldn't manage it, needed help. And it said they appointed the first deacons of the church to go out on behalf of the bishop and essentially extend the reach of what the bishop could do in feeding and nurturing and caring for those of the community. And that's still what we do to this day. This is the one where Stephen was sent out, remember, and then they stoned him to death, and they sent Philip out, right? Which was brave of him, because he just watched what happened to Stephen. But he went and he did it anyway. His job was to go and care for the community, feeding them out in the world. Our deacons still do that. So Brenda has been appointed by Bishop Clark to be the deacon of the cathedral, to go out and be a part of caring for the needs of the community. Now you may be asking, because Brenda's also had a lot of health issues right now and actually hasn't been able to serve, but mostly because we care for Brenda, we love Brenda, we've hoped she will get better so that she can come back and serve here. We haven't wanted to replace her in that way. But in theory, we could get to a time where, either Brenda wants to officially retire or officially won't be coming back, in which case the bishop will probably appoint a new deacon to be the deacon here. But to be clear, the deacon doesn't technically work for the rector or the dean here. The deacon is appointed by the bishop. Now, it wouldn't make much sense.
Does the bishop pay them? Or is the
And
parish
they're
paying?
usually not paid. They're almost exclusively
Oh,
unpaid
okay.
positions. Yeah, almost exclusively unpaid positions. Now, I will say, you could imagine functionally what would happen in our church staff meeting if Brenda or another deacon is sitting there and our dean looks at her and says, "Would you do so and so?" And she says, "I don't work for you.
Yeah.
You can't make me."
Wait,
Like, she doesn't. Technically works for the bishop, but you could see how that functionally isn't good. And so frequently, because the bishop's not in the room at the staff meeting, the deacon is usually following the direction of the person who's running, the rector or the dean who's running the community. But technically is there appointed by the bishop. And so if you had somebody here who's maybe thinking about being ordained a deacon, that person would work for the bishop, and the bishop would say, "I want you to go be the deacon at St. Paul and the Redeemer, because that's where we need the help." Or "I want you to go be the deacon at St. John's, because that's where we need the help." Or "I need you to be the deacon at St. James, because that's where we need the help." That's what we did with Tim Holt. So Tim Holt, and we remember Tim. Tim Holt, member of the parish here, went through the ordination process, was made a deacon of the church, and then was told by the bishop, "Where we really need you is at St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Austin." And so Tim was sent there to be the deacon there.
Need a flowchart. A glossary.
So now this makes sense to everybody?
clear as mud.
We only have a couple of weeks more actually to get into some of canons and constitution stuff. We're going to spend a little more time looking at St. James stuff specifically, and part of that will be the process of how we do it here. Like, how do we select members of our not our bishop's committee, Cathedral chapter. There's too many names to keep track of. Thank you. So how do we select the members of our Cathedral chapter here? How do we select delegates who then go and vote on our behalf? How do they select deputies who then go to General Convention? And maybe what we can fit into some of that too is some of the discernment process about how we take somebody and make them an ordained clergy person in the church. That's good questions, y'all. I mean,
Thank you.
you now know more about this than almost everybody in the church who worship week in and week out with us, but have no idea how any of this works. So you're the experts. Now you can go and share your. This would be great pub trivia knowledge. You'd be able to go and wow everybody. How do you know these things? In pub trivia, what's the difference between an archdeacon and a?
Is there ever an opportunity in the future to talk about how the canons affect major events like the formation of the Anglican Church in North America and the splitting of dioceses?
Yeah.
You know, what happens to episcopal authority when something like that happens?
That's great. You know what? I think that would fit in with what I'm hoping we can get to next week. I think that would fit in with it because it's almost a little bit of a story of what happens when we disagree about how to interpret this and what's the process. And that's partly how you end up with an Anglican Church of North America and an Episcopal Church that both say they're following the canons, but disagree with each other. Well, thank you.
All right, thank
I
you.
think that's good for today.